The Shepnaz podcast begins now.
Welcome to the Shepnaz podcast. I'm Joe, and we are all about helping people take their next step toward Jesus. Yesterday, we started getting into Rob's sermon from this past Sunday, and when he was talking from the book of Revelation, addressing the church of Smyrna and the church today. And today, we are going to continue that conversation as we look into Revelation chapter 2, verses 8 through 11. Welcome back, Rob.
Thank you. Good to be here.
So, kind of get us back up to speed of where we were when we were talking yesterday.
Yeah, so we are talking this particular letter. Jesus, in chapter 2 and chapter 3, Jesus writes a letter to 7 different churches. This week, we're talking about the second church that Jesus wrote a letter to, the church in Smyrna, not to be confused with Smirnoff, as my computer thinks, because it can't spell that, but Smyrna. And the Christians in Smyrna were facing extreme persecution. In the last episode, we talked about some of the things that they were experiencing persecution from. It was from the government. It was from the religious people in Rome who were worshiping neo-pagan gods such as Zeus and Apollos and Aphrodite, those kinds of gods. And then just the different things that they were experiencing from the Jewish people who were not Christians, that didn't believe in Jesus. They were kind of spreading slanderous lies about them. And all of this was contributing to a great deal of persecution that they were experiencing. The Christians in Smyrna were being, often executed, oppressed mentally, emotionally, physically, in every way that you could think of. And so we talked about the persecution. And Jesus says, I know your afflictions. And then what we're going to pick up today was he says, also, I know your poverty.
So if we jump in here with Revelation 2:10, it says, do not be afraid of what you're about to suffer. I tell you, the devil will put some of you in prison to test you, and you will suffer persecution for 10 days. Be faithful even to the point of death, and I will give you life as your victor's crown. Whoever has ears, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. The one who is victorious will not be hurt at all by the second death.
Yeah. So there's a lot in that. So Jesus spends time talking to these Christians about the persecution they're experiencing. He talks a little bit about their poverty, and they were experiencing great financial repercussions. People who were not Christians would avoid their businesses. They wouldn't spend money there. Their businesses and shops were often vandalized and looted. They were unable to join some of the guilds, which were groups of workers and craftsmen that would get sent out on jobs, kind of like a union sort of. And so they experienced unemployment. And the word poverty that Jesus used when he says, I know your poverty, was understood to mean the status of someone who must beg to survive. Like they were literally destitute. They didn't have anything. Everything was taken from them. And then this is what Jesus says there in verse 10, like you read. He says, I know there are people who are saying things about you. I know what you're experiencing, but don't be afraid, right? Don't be afraid. And so here's what's interesting. In each of these churches, Jesus comes and he compliments all the good things they're doing. And then he says, but, right? He throws that in there. It's like, but this is what I want you to work on. In the church of Smyrna, there was no but. There was no concern. There was no criticism. Jesus didn't say, you guys need to do this or need to do that. He just said, I know what you're going through. And he goes, keep going. Like he had no criticism for them. And part of that is because when you're experiencing persecution, you're the real deal or you're not.
Right.
Like if you're not the real deal, like you just leave and you don't have to experience it. But what held their feet to the fire, figuratively speaking, is that they continued to love Jesus in the face of that. If they would have just pledged their loyalty to the Roman governor, if they would have just said something like, Jesus isn't real, or, they could go to work. They could have gotten whatever, people would have started buying from them. The persecution would have stopped. But they're like, but it's real. Jesus is real, and I can't deny him, and I can't deny that. And so when Jesus comes to the church to look for something that's wrong, he sees a group of people who have stayed true in the midst of this suffering and never gave in, right? They never stopped. And so in the notes this week, I said persecution refines true faith and it uncovers false faith. So
for sure.
So anybody that's there that had some level of false faith, or they're like, I'm just in it for, why would you be a Christian then? Like, there is no good reason to be a Christian then, except for that you really believe that Jesus was the way. Because you're going to face this persecution. You are going to face the suffering and all, and the results of that, the poverty and the mental and emotional and physical and financial oppression. And so they were like, Jesus comes to this church and he's like, you guys are awesome. I mean, he's like, I know what you're going through. I've been there and I feel for you. And so, they've got this real faith, but then Jesus delivers some news to them. And then he says, and if you're these guys, you're thinking, oh, this is awesome. Jesus is here. He knows what we're going through. He's going to tell us it's over.
Right.
And Jesus does not deliver that news. Jesus says, I tell you, the devil is going to put some of you in prison to test you, and you will suffer persecution for 10 days. Like, Jesus is like, I see what you're going through. You guys are amazing. You're awesome. And it's not going to let up.
Yeah. Here's the bad news. It's going to get a little worse.
Yeah. That's not the kind of news Jesus should be delivering, it seems like, right?
Well, and sometimes it's not the Jesus we want to make him out to be.
Yeah.
We always want to jump to that conclusion that, well, if things are going rough in my life right now, Jesus is going to see and he's going to make everything turn around to what I think is better. And it may not necessarily work out that way.
Right. I think the interesting thing about this is that Jesus wasn't predicting that things were going to get better. He was preparing them for what was coming. Like, he knew. He was sovereign, right? Mm-hmm. And he knew what was coming. And Jesus even said that to the disciples. He says, I've told you these things so that in me you can have peace, but in this world you will have trouble. But take heart, I've overcome the world. Like, Jesus didn't say, in this world you might have trouble. I mean, he said, oh, you're a follower of Jesus? You're following me? Remember what they did to me?
Right.
They're coming after you eventually. Yeah. So he's like, you're going to have trouble.
That actually makes me remember Pastor Tim preached a couple weeks ago when James and John, they wanted to be at the right hand and the left hand. And they said, and Jesus said to them, you don't really know what you're asking for. Because he knows what was to come. Yeah.
And incidentally, both of those guys died a martyr's death. Mm-hmm. Not. I mean, it's a little while after that, but it was a bad deal for them. So anyway, Jesus is like, guys, I know what you're going through, and I'm so proud of you, kind of thing. And then it's like, and just want you to know it's going to get worse. But then he gives them this call to action, and so he says it's going to get worse, and you're going to suffer for 10 days. And there's a lot of talk about whether the 10 days was actually 10 days, whether 10 days was like 10 periods and it meant something more than a day or whatever. And nobody ever really came to I don't have anything to say about that. But anyway, 10, maybe a day is 1,000 years. So it's 10, I have no idea. But anyway, but this is what he does say. He says, it's going to get worse. He says, but do not be afraid of what you're about to suffer. Like, he's like, it's going to get worse, but don't be afraid. Like, I don't want you to be afraid. And then he says, in fact, be faithful even to the point of death. And like, those are not encouraging words either. Like, if you're expecting some encouragement and Jesus is like, hey, it's going to get worse, be faithful even if you have to die. I mean, you start playing through, what is going to happen to me? What's going to happen? But it's such a magnanimous statement that Jesus would say, it's going to get worse, but be faithful. And what's interesting to me is not that Jesus said that you might lose your life. It's what's incredible to me is that Jesus is saying it's more important to be faithful to him than to go on living and be unfaithful.
Now more than ever, we are in desperate need of the move of God in our world, our nation, our community, and our families. Prayer is a key ingredient in navigating this journey with the hope and assurance of Jesus. Shepherd Church is in the midst of 21 days of prayer, and we would invite you to join. There is a prayer guide available at shepnaz.org. Just click on the 21 days of prayer, and you will find a downloadable guide. Our 21 days of prayer will conclude Sunday evening, October 1st, with a night of praise and worship beginning at 6 p.m. And, in a strange way, that would actually be encouraging to me.
Yeah.
Because if I hadn't heard from him ahead of time, that he knew it was coming,
Yeah.
you'd be in the midst of this. And when you're looking at the possibility of death, you'd be like, should I be doing something different? Is he telling me to do something different? He's telling them ahead of time, this is coming, and I want you to know when that time comes, go all the way to the point of death if you have to. And so they already know when they're going into that situation.
Yeah. Well, I think it was a masterful thing that Jesus said, because what he did was, like you said, in their suffering, you start wondering, have I done something wrong? What Jesus did is he gave purpose to their suffering. Mm-hmm. He's like, if you're suffering and you're going through this, I can go back in my head. Jesus said this is going to happen. I'm right where I need to be. I don't need to question it. I don't need to doubt anything. And so for Jesus, it's like when they're hungry, when they're being insulted, when they're being assaulted, when they're being executed, when they see their friends and family members mistreated and torn from them and ultimately leave this life, it gave them purpose. It reminded them that there's something to this. That gave them hope. And it said that being faithful is more important than living. And here's the other thing that I think is interesting. What Jesus is ultimately saying is that he is better than life.
Right.
I mean, that's incredible. I mean, he didn't say those words, but it's what he communicated. It's like, just hang in there, even if you have to die, because what's coming after that is better than what you're going through now. And what's coming after that is eternal life with me. And then he goes on, and so he said, and maybe Jesus was thinking about what David said in Psalm 63:3, when David says, your love is better than life.
Right.
It's like, it always goes back. It always comes back around. And then Jesus says that if you would, there's consequences, and the good consequences are, I'll give you the crown of life. And interestingly, one of the first New Testament books that was written was the book of James. And James says this, he says, blessed is the man who perseveres under trial, because when he has stood the test, he will receive the crown of life that God has promised to those who love him. And the last book of the Old Testament, and the last part of it, Jesus says, if you endure, I'm going to give you the crown of life. It's like they bookended this whole story with, this is what you get. And the Bible talks about different crowns that believers will receive and have in heaven. And the crown of life is for those who endure persecution unto death. Like, there will be people in heaven that we will see that will have a crown. And when we see that crown, we will know that they gave their life for the gospel. They were true all the way to death. And that's the crown that they're going to get. And I'm sure it's more than a hat.
Yes,
I'm sure it probably comes with something. It's not like you get to wear the hat in heaven for eternity. It's probably going to come with some level of reward or responsibility in the afterlife. I don't know. But Jesus said, there's more coming for you. And what is after the fire, what is after whatever level of persecution you're experiencing, is better than anything you could have ahead of time. And then Jesus, one last thing he says, he who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. He who overcomes will not be hurt at all by the second death. And that's interesting, the second death part. And we see that talked about in the Old Testament in the book of Daniel. And here it comes back up again in Revelation. Of course, Daniel is a very prophetic book as well. But what Jesus is saying is that the second death is the destiny of the unsaved after their bodily resurrection. So Jesus is saying everyone's going to die unless you're alive when he comes back. And then everyone who's died is going to come back to life, right? And they're going to stand before the judgment seat of Christ. And for those who didn't know Jesus, they're going to be judged and sent to eternity. That's the second death. And the Bible talks about that. It says they'll be thrown into the lake of fire. The lake of fire is the second death. So Jesus is saying is that if you know me and you stay true, you're not going to experience that. There's a reward coming for you. But if you are not faithful and you don't know me, there's punishment coming for eternity. And I read this a couple weeks ago. I was reading a book on prayer, and I've read this quote, and I wrote it down. and I think it applies perfectly here. It says, those who are born twice will only die once. Those who are born only once will die twice.
I can share my music heritage there. There was actually a Gaither vocal band song back in the 80s that was the hook to the song.
Yeah.
Was born once, die twice, born twice, die once.
Maybe it came from them, or maybe they were quoting somebody else. I don't know. But again, it just talks about how important it is that we have a relationship with Jesus, and that we are faithful, whatever it is that we're experiencing or whatever it is that we're going through. And so for you today, if you're listening, if you experience persecution or when it comes, because it will come, Jesus says when it comes, the good news is that Jesus knows everything about what you're going through. You will never go through something that Jesus doesn't know about. And the good news is that he's there with you. You're not alone, and that it's not going to last forever. There's an end to it. There will be an end to it. And that being faithful is better than life. Being faithful is better than being unfaithful, and it brings this great reward for us that we get to experience the presence of Jesus in our lives. And so that's encouraging and good news.
Well, we recognize that there has been a lot of persecution in the past, and certainly the Church of Smyrna was going through persecution. But that's happening in the world today also.
Yeah.
Not so much in the United States. I mean, we have little things we complain about, but certainly doesn't rise to the level of persecution.
Right.
But that's not necessarily the case around the world.
Right. Yeah, we wanted to just take a minute before we wrap this up and just draw some attention to the fact that around the world we have brothers and sisters who are experiencing persecution today. I get an email from a ministry called Voice of the Martyrs, and I get it a couple times a week. And just yesterday I got an email, talked about believers in Eritrea who have been captured and thrown in shipping containers and just locked in there as their persecution until they renounce Jesus or probably die. There's all kinds of stuff happening around the world, and because it doesn't happen here, it doesn't mean it's not happening. There's a ministry called Open Doors, and they release a list every year of the 50 countries that where Christians are most persecuted. And they did a study not too long ago, about a year or so ago, and they calculated that there's an average of 13 Christians that are killed every day because of their faith. And so as believers, those are our brothers and sisters. Those are people we're going to spend eternity with. And unfortunately, they're in a place where they are experiencing a greater deal of persecution than we are. And I just wanted to remind you that there's some, we as Christians have an opportunity to do something about it. In Hebrews chapter 13, verse 3, it says, remember those in prison as if you were their fellow prisoners, and those who are mistreated as if you yourselves were suffering as well. And so I just want to give you a couple ways that we could connect with the persecuted church. And one of them is first and most importantly is to pray for them. And when you're praying for the persecuted church, there's some things you could do specifically to pray for their protection, because many of them are suffering physically, being beaten and tortured and starved. And so pray for their protection, but also pray for their strength, that God will give them strength, physical strength as well as emotional and spiritual strength as well. Pray that the Holy Spirit would be present with them and would comfort them as they're walking through difficult days. You think about the Christians in Smyrna and how the encouragement came knowing that Jesus was with them and he knew what was going on. Pray that for the persecuted Christians around the world, that they'll have a confidence that Jesus is with them. And pray for change. Pray that God would change the hearts of those who are persecuting them. God can do that. Think about Paul. Paul was the most fierce and staunch persecutor of the church. And when we read the Bible today, half of the New Testament seems like was written by him, because God transformed his heart, and God can do that. And so I want to just encourage you to do that. A couple other ways is pray that whatever their circumstances, that God would give them the right words, because sometimes they have the opportunity to minister, and that God could speak through them to other people. And I've heard stories of where because of the faithfulness and the humility of Christians who are being persecuted, their persecutors came to know Jesus as well. And God can do amazing and incredible things. And then pray that God will give those who are being persecuted peace in the sufficiency of God's grace. Pray that they will draw a strength from a source greater than themselves, and that God would just be present. And I think it's also important sometimes families suffer together, but sometimes a greater way of causing suffering is they'll take a person out of the family, and then the family knows that that person is suffering and that the rest of the family is not, and families get ripped apart. And so I just want to encourage you to pray for families of Christians who are being persecuted as well. There's a couple of quick resources I would encourage you to check out. One is called The Voice of the Martyrs. You can just Google that and you'll come up, and they've got a website that's very helpful, helping you to know how to pray, how to support persecuted church. Another is called Christians in Crisis, and you could look that up as well. And these are just some ministries that focus their resources and attention on trying to help and serve people around the world who are being persecuted. And so, again, while it's not happening here like it is in other parts of the world, it is happening. And as believers, we have a responsibility to remember our brothers and sisters who are in prison and pray for them as if we were right there with them. And so I just want to encourage us to do that.
Amen. Well, Pastor Rob, we want to thank you for sharing the word with us today and being able to take a look at the Church of Smyrna and the message to them, and also this challenge of the next step that we can take and how we can walk alongside our brothers and sisters around the world that are suffering persecution. We'll be sure to put in the show notes some of those links that he was talking about. If you have any questions or if you have trouble finding that information, just email us at podcast@shepnaz.org. Also check us out on YouTube, Facebook, and Instagram. For Pastor Rob, I'm Joe. Have a great day. This podcast is a production of the Shepherd Church of the Nazarene, Gahanna, Ohio. Email to podcast@shepnaz.org and let us know what you think.